This is part 4 and hopefully the last part of the Chapter 1 lecture notes. I try to keep it to 4 lectures, by the way, recorded lectures, because that equals to an hour if they all total out to 15 minutes. Occasionally there will be 5, but I try not to make it longer than that. But anyway, going back to the directional terms, proximal and distal are kind of tough to understand. When a structure is proximal or distal, we're referring to near or far away from the shoulder joint or the hip joint. So for example, the elbow is proximal to the wrist. The wrist is distal to the elbow. So proximal is the one closest to the shoulder. Distal is the one farthest away. So the elbow is proximal, the wrist is distal. The knee is proximal, the ankle and toes are distal. And if we're looking at ankle and toes, let's just compare those. The ankle would actually be proximal to the toes, and the toes would be distal to the ankle. So these are comparison terms, but we're using them in relation to the major joints of the body, the shoulder joint or the hip joint. And I also wanted to say that these terms are covered in a little video clip. It's really good, though, in Lab 1. So when you go and do Lab 1 in your Mastering A&P, it's on medical terminology. That little video clip is great. It's like a kind of a cartoonish kind of thing, but it's really, really good for explaining the directional terms. We also have superficial and deep. Superficial is close to the surface and deep is further inside your body. So let me see. Like a superficial cut, would be closer to the surface of the skin. A deep cut would penetrate deeper. The pancreas is deep to the stomach because it lies kind of underneath the stomach. So the pancreas is deep and the stomach is more superficial compared to the pancreas. They're both deep, but the pancreas goes deeper into the body than what the stomach does. If you lifted up the stomach, the pancreas would be underneath it. And that may not be the greatest example either. Let's see. Let's say ribs. Okay, so the ribs are going to be more superficial to the heart. The heart is deep to the ribs. I think that's better. Okay, let's move on. Those are directional terms. Let's see. Also, if we are looking at, for example, a cadaver, or if someone is going into surgical technology, and we're talking about cuts that a surgeon might make, you need to understand what these sections or cuts would be, the way that they would be made. A frontal plane or coronal plane is going to be like a slice into the body that divides it into a front and back. So an anterior and posterior portion. A sagittal plane is going to cut down the middle of the body. It's going to divide the body into left and right portions, and a transverse plane is like a cross cut. So if you look at these planes as glass, this purple glass is going through the female's body in a frontal or coronal plane, and the blue glass is going through as a sagittal plane, dividing it into left and right halves. And then the green glass is cutting through in a transverse plane, which is going to be like a cross section that's going to cut horizontally through the body and divide it into upper and lower portions, or we could say superior and inferior portions. Okay, body cavities. The body cavities are lined by serous membranes. There are 2 major regions. There's the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity, which are separated by the diaphragm. And I need to show you a picture here. Okay, so first of all, we have the dorsal body cavity, which includes the brain and the spine, the spinal cord. That's the dorsal body cavity. The ventral body cavity is the one that I'm going over now, and that includes the thoracic cavity, or the chest, and the abdominopelvic cavity. So going back, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity are both found in the ventral body cavity. Let me write that one. Ventral. Whereas the brain and the spinal cord would be in the dorsal body cavity. But the ventral body cavity contains most of our organs, which that would be the organs in the chest would be the heart and the lungs. That's the thoracic cavity, and then the abdominopelvic cavity contains all the other organs, the abdominal organs. So serous membranes are ones that line some of these body cavities. They produce a watery fluid called serous fluid. There are two layers of serous membranes. There's the parietal layer, which is on the outside, and then the visceral layer covers the surface of the visceral organs. There are three serous membranes. Two are in the thoracic cavity. The pericardial cavity and the pericardial membrane surrounds the heart. The cavity contains the heart. The pericardial membrane, or the pericardium, surrounds the heart. And the pleura, or pleural membrane, surrounds the lungs. So the pericardium consists of the visceral pericardium, which actually covers and contacts the heart, and the parietal pericardium, which is separated from the visceral pericardium by pericardial fluid. So it's the outer layer, and the heart and the pericardial cavity, including the pericardium that surrounds the heart, lies within the mediastinum. Now, the pleural cavities contain the lungs, and each lung has its own pleural cavity, so there are two. The serous membrane that covers the lungs is called the pleura. The visceral pleura contacts the lungs. The parietal pleura lies outside the visceral pleura, and there is pleural fluid in between the visceral and parietal pleura. Then we have the peritoneal cavity, and that is the cavity in which the abdominal organs lie and the pelvic organs lie. So we call that membrane the peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum covers organs like the stomach and the liver. It actually contacts them. Then there's the parietal peritoneum, which lines the body wall. So it's outside the visceral peritoneum. And then in between the visceral and parietal would be peritoneal fluid. Any organs that are outside of the peritoneum, which is the lining of the abdominopelvic cavity, are called retroperitoneal. For example, the kidneys and the pancreas are retroperitoneal. All right, so what we're showing here is the heart, and this part of the heart, of the pericardium, is the visceral pericardium, and then the part that lies outside is the parietal pericardium. So you have the part of the pericardium that contacts the heart. It's called the visceral, and here you can see it better. The visceral pericardium, and the parietal lies outside, and in between there is the pericardial fluid. Notice this illustration of the fist punching into a balloon. So there's part of the balloon that's going to touch the fist. That would be the visceral layer of the serous membrane, no matter which one we're talking about. Then the part that's outside that doesn't actually contact the fist, we call that the parietal layer. And then in this airspace would be the serous fluid. Okay, so we have the pericardium that surrounds the heart, visceral and parietal layers. We have the pleura that surrounds the lungs, visceral and parietal layers. And then we have the peritoneum, that surrounds the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay. All right, let's see. Checkpoint questions. If a surgeon makes an incision just inferior to the diaphragm, what body cavity will be opened? That's going to be the abdominal cavity. And that is it.